Welcome back. The last two videos are going to discuss Baruchello and Johnstone's essay and my own, which together constitute what I hope will make sense as a life value synthesis of the arguments that we have been exploring together over the term. What does it synthesize? It synthesizes the rights recognized in the standard interpretation with the alternative conception of human individuality and its relationships with nature and society, which have been the underlying philosophical basis of the criticisms of the standard view. So let me begin by reviewing where we have been, and then I want to spend most of my time in the video discussion exploring and explaining what Baruchello and Johnstone call life value onto axiology. The term comes from the work of the Canadian philosopher John McMurtry, my thesis supervisor. My own work has contributed to life value onto axiology, as we will see when we turn to my essay. And then I'll talk more briefly about how Baruchello and Johnstone read and interpret the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights through the lens of life value philosophy. And that will lead us to what we're going to recognize as the working definition of social justice that I proposed at the beginning of the class. So, first of all, where have we been? We started with what I called the standard interpretation of human rights. Standard interpretation because it read human rights through the lens of classical liberal philosophy, and it thought of human rights as universal forms of the natural rights, or what were posited or theorized as natural rights in the 18th century. These rights assume that individuals, as we have been saying, are moral atoms. Not that they don't have any relationships or connections with the natural world or each other or social institutions, but what is of essential value about individuals is this moral core, their moral nature, our dignity and our agency and our capacity to choose our lives for ourselves. So human rights extend these natural rights beyond the limits of membership in a national community. Right? You don't have to be a citizen of country A, B, or C to enjoy human rights. That's why they are universal. They're not universal in an ontological sense. Right? They're not part of the fabric of reality. They are part of human history. And since 1948, they have been gaining wider and wider allegiance as the legal and institutional mechanism to address and resolve fundamental social problems. We've examined a number of criticisms. We've examined criticisms from the perspective of non-Western cultures. Abu Lughod and Mikhail Mutua gave us different versions of that criticism. We've looked at them critically from a Marxist perspective. That was the work of Teeple. And we've looked at them from the perspective of what Virginia Held called the feminist ethics of care. And that criticism had connections with the Marxist arguments on the one hand and with the cultural pluralist arguments on the other. Without ignoring the differences between those three sets of criticisms, I think we can see that there's an important set of overlapping ideas at the root of them. And what they really contest is this conception of individuality that is central to the standard interpretation. Just as the standard interpretation recognizes the importance of connections, so too the criticisms understand that that humans are individuals, okay? But they understand individuality from a social perspective. It is a development out of and an achievement of certain forms of social organization. And so it puts more stress on our dependence on the natural world and our interdependence with each other. Right? It downplays autonomy in favor of caring, need-satisfying relationships. Now, different stresses are emphasized in the Marxist criticism or the cultural pluralist criticism or the ethics of care criticism. I won't go through all the details. Previous lectures and discussions and the notes have covered that sufficiently. But that's the opposition. right? Abstract individuality as the moral center of human being on the one hand, and a social and cultural conception of human beings as dependent and interdependent on the other. The life value synthesis proposes that we can preserve the rights that are recognized in the standard interpretation. We don't need an alternative set of rights, but we have to reinterpret them. We have to reinterpret them in terms of the real conditions of existence of human beings. We do have essential and universal moral interests from the perspective of life value philosophy, right? But these are products or developments of certain forms of social interaction. The fundamental problem is not rights versus non-rights, a society that requires rights versus a society which has somehow evolved beyond the need for rights. The fundamental problem is how we understand social relationships, how we produce and distribute social resources, and how we understand the role of rights as entitlements to those resources, to fundamental forms of treatment. Okay. So let me talk now about the basics of life value ontoaxiology. Ontoaxiology sounds daunting, I realize, but it's not that difficult to understand. Onto, from ontology, and we know from our first assignment that ontology is the philosophical discipline that explores the nature of being or reality. Right? And axiology is the philosophical study of values. So ontoaxiology is the exploration of the relationship between values and social and natural reality. The main philosophical contention of life value ontoaxiology is that all values are grounded in the existence and the needs of living things. Okay? In the work of McMurtry, who was the first to systematize life value ontoaxiology, although the ideas, there's many different sources of some of the ideas which we can't get into right now. But if you do want to talk about it, email me, and I'm happy to get into some of those sources. The fundamental point of the ground of all values, according to McMurtry, is the existence of living things and their needs. Right? So he starts from what he calls the life ground of value, which is the set of material conditions, natural and, in the case of human beings, social, apart from which living things cannot survive and develop their distinctive capacities. So prior to making the video, I was out in the garden trying to distract myself from the tensions generated by the ongoing crisis. I was cleaning up some old leaves and old plants from the fall and winter. And the new plants are coming up, right? And they are rooted in the soil. That rootedness in the soil is a wonderful visual metaphor to understand the life ground of value. They can't live without the roots that are drawing nutrients from the earth. And human beings can't live unless the rest of nature is growing and developing and supplying the things that we need. So any living thing has to be rooted in its life ground. Right? It has to have regular access to the resources and the relationships and in our case, the institutions that we require to live and develop. So the important thing to note here is that, or two important things to note. First of all, the life ground is universal. The echinacea flowers that are just beginning to poke their head through the soil in my garden is their life ground of value. Right? That same soil is part of the human life ground of value, but our life ground is more extensive. As the current crisis is making clear, our lives also depend equally upon functioning social institutions. So the life ground of value is universal. It's not anthropocentric. Right? All living things have a ground of value. They all have needs that they have to satisfy. But in the case of human beings, there's a natural and social component to the life ground of our value. So this shows that there's going to be an important difference between the life value interpretation of human rights and Donnelly's standard interpretation. You'll recall that Donnelly rejected needs as the foundation of rights because he claimed that needs can only be coherently understood at a physical biological level. The life ground philosophy, life ground ontoaxiology rejects that. Human beings have natural needs and they have social needs. Right? We have a need for food. We have a need, therefore, for an agricultural system, but we also have a need for a distribution network. Right? The issue that is currently being addressed by closing the border to civilian traffic but not to trucks is that the food distribution network, especially for Canada, reaches into the States. There can be food in the abstract, but if it can't get to where it needs to be, it's of no good to anyone. So those distribution networks are equally part of our life ground of value. So needs are both social and natural for human beings. What Baruchello and Johnstone try to show in their essay is that if we work through each of the rights recognized and asserted in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we will see that those rights all recognize and respond to underlying needs. Now, they go through this in quite a bit of detail, and I will leave the details to you because it's fairly straightforwardly written. The bulk of the essay simply reinterprets the rights as rooted in the needs, and therefore argues that, ideologically driven criticisms of human rights, such as Teeple's, miss the underlying recognition of fundamental human needs, right? They get caught up in the ideological use of human rights, right? And they miss the underlying life value. So, I'll come back to the document in a moment. Let me continue to discuss in a little more detail what life value means. In its most fundamental sense, life value is found in those goods, resources, relationships, and institutions that satisfy the needs of living things. Okay? So whatever it is in an object or a relationship that satisfies the need, that is the most basic form of life value. If we don't access that, we can't live. And if we can't live, we can't create beauty, we can't love one another, we can't build political systems, right? All of which have life value, as we'll see in a second, but if we are not alive, none of that can exist. So the most basic form of life value is that in the object or resource or relationship or institution which meets the need of a living thing and enables it to live. But life in life value philosophy is not simply biological. It's not simply respiration or metabolism or however we might define life from a medical standpoint. Life is about unfolding and realizing our capacities. In McMurtry's philosophy, he generalizes and says there are three sorts of life capacities. There's sentience, right? Our awareness, our consciousness of the world, our ability to feel, right? There is the capacity for movement, which in human beings is articulated as creative gesture and construction and building of all sorts. And then there is thinking. All sentient life forms have intrinsic value from the standpoint of life value philosophy, but it's not of all the same scope and depth. Human beings are simply capable of more types of valuable and valued relationship with each other and the wider world, right? I'm sure that in a chemical way, the echinacea plants that are now starting to grow in my garden are, they're deriving the benefit from the nutrients in the soil. But there's little evidence to suggest that they are capable of actively appreciating those elements, right? But human beings not only take in nutrients, we can